You've repeatedly called the Save America Act Jim Crow 2.0. Can you just be a little bit more specific?
This is not a voter ID bill, period.
On the other side of the aisle have come up with this deeply weird theory that somehow this legislation punishes women in America because some women, not all, but some women take their spouse's name when they get married, and that somehow will, as if the women of America are not smart enough to figure it out, that somehow will impede their ability to register to vote and to vote. I don't get that part.
They're panicking because the SAVE Act is about to shut the whole game down. Watch this. The second voter ID starts gaining momentum, Democrats lose it. Suddenly it's Jim Crow 2.0 all over again, because they know this kills the loopholes. You've got Chuck Schumer doubling down on fear tactics instead of facts, while John Kennedy steps in and calls the whole thing out, laying out how this bill can pass whether Democrats like it or not. This isn't about voting rights. This is about control. And what you're about to see exposes exactly who's trying to keep the system wide open. Let's dive in.
It is purge the voters off. People know it. And why the right wing is so angry we call it Jim Crow? Because they know it's true.
We need to try to pass this legislation through reconciliation. Now, you know how reconciliation works, Mr. President. It means we can pass this bill with 50 Republican votes and the vice president to break the tie. That's how we pass the one big, beautiful bill. I would hope to get some of my Democratic friends to support us, but we don't have to have them. That's harder than I describe because, as you know, Mr. President, there are parameters on reconciliation. Anything you propose through reconciliation has to be paid for. We can find the money to pay for it. And anything you pass through reconciliation has to conform with the contours of the Budget Control Act. We call that giving a provision a bird bath. And our parliamentarian decides what passes muster under the Budget Control Act and what doesn't. Now, we've got a lot of smart lawyers in the United States Senate. Every single one of them thinks they're Oliver Wendell Scalia. But we've got a lot of other smart lawyers in America. Here's what I'm getting at. We have yet to try going to these smart lawyers, some in the Senate and some, believe it or not, not in the Senate, and saying, craft us a SAVE Act that will pass muster under the Budget Control Act and can be blessed by the parliamentarians. And some of my colleagues, those Oliver Wendell Scalia types, they say, Kennedy, you know, that you'll never be able to do that. They don't know. I've been here 10 years. I've seen things pass muster, survive a bird bath that I didn't think had a hope in hell. And I've seen provisions pass the parliamentarians' judgment under a bird bath that I thought, I've seen them not pass that I thought were slam dunks. You don't know till you try. And we haven't tried. And if this bill is as important as everybody says it is, and I think it is, because we're not just talking about voting, we're talking about the confidence, the trust of the American people in our elections. If this bill is as important as we say it is, we should try it through reconciliation.
Very often, as is the case with voting, if we make it easy to cheat, then your constitutionally protected right to vote will mean less and less with each passing election. And our failure to take these risks seriously further undermines the public perception of the legitimacy of the rights in question. Now, the mere fact that something is a country doesn't mean you can't make it harder for people to break the law and gaining access to it. Otherwise, there would be all sorts of things that would be off in our society. Because according to my colleague's logic, a signature is all the identification you need. Well, is it? Well, signatures can be forged. With increasing ease, they can be forged. In other circumstances, they can be presumed not to be checked, and in some cases, that might pan out to be more true than in others. But nobody would seriously suggest, particularly those who like these background check laws, they wouldn't be content with somebody just signing their name, even if it said, I hereby declare under penalty of perjury that I am entitled to purchase this firearm, that I am an adult, I'm a U.S. citizen, I have not been convicted of a felony offense, which would disqualify me under 18 U.S.C. Section 922G. Nor do I trigger any of the other exclusionary factors articulated in the various subsections of 922G or under any other federal law. The signature wouldn't do it there, and that's a constitutionally protected right. This is a constitutionally protected right.
What happens when a senator claims a voting bill is about trust in elections, but ignores who it actually hurts? In a recent Senate exchange, Senator John Kennedy dismissed concerns about the SAVE Act, mocking the idea that it could restrict women's ability to vote and calling opposition nothing more than fear tactics. But the reality behind this bill is far more serious and far more dangerous than he suggests. The SAVE Act is being pushed as a measure to strengthen election integrity by requiring proof of citizenship and stricter identification requirements. Supporters argue it prevents fraud and restores public confidence. Critics, including multiple voting rights groups, warn it could disenfranchise millions of eligible voters. During the debate, Kennedy argued that concerns about married women struggling with documentation were exaggerated and even absurd. But dismissing those concerns ignores a basic reality of how identity documentation works in the United States. Millions of American women change their last name after marriage. That means their birth certificates, passports, and other documents often no longer match their current legal identity. Requiring strict proof of citizenship at the ballot box creates additional bureaucratic steps, not for criminals, but for ordinary citizens who have done nothing wrong. This isn't about whether women are smart enough to figure it out. It's about whether the government is placing unnecessary obstacles between citizens and their constitutional right to vote. Kennedy also compared voter identification to background checks for gun purchases, suggesting that if ID is required for one constitutional right, it should be required for another. But this analogy is misleading. Voting is a universal civic duty exercised by hundreds of millions of people, often under tight deadlines, limited access to government offices, and inconsistent documentation systems across states. Adding more paperwork doesn't stop organised fraud, which studies repeatedly show is extremely rare. But it does create friction for people who are already navigating complex administrative systems. In other words, the policy risks solving a problem that barely exists while creating new ones for legitimate voters. When politicians frame voting access as a threat rather than a right, the conversation shifts from protecting democracy to controlling participation. Laws like the SAVE Act are often presented as neutral security measures, but in practice, they disproportionately affect groups that already face structural barriers. Women who change their names, low-income voters, naturalized citizens, and elderly Americans without updated documents. That's why critics describe these proposals as modern voter suppression, not because of rhetoric, but because of their real-world impact. Confidence in elections doesn't come from making it harder to vote. It comes from ensuring that every eligible citizen can participate without unnecessary obstacles. When lawmakers dismiss legitimate concerns as hysteria or ignorance, they're not defending democracy, they're narrowing it. And in a country built on the principle that every vote counts, that should concern everyone, regardless of party.